Oh, welcome back to another College Football with Sam live show. I was a little bit sicker today. I got a little bit worse than previous, and admittedly got a little bit overwhelmed. So apologies about the late start, but we are going to be talking about some games today. We're going to be previewing some games, that being Ole Miss, Oklahoma, which I think is going to be the most exciting and biggest game of the weekend, at least the one that comes forward in my mind. We're going to be doing some more in-depth videos on that besides this preview, but those will be in the coming days. And Northwestern versus Nebraska and Iowa versus Minnesota will be the other games that we discuss today. So Michigan State, and plenty of other games will be coming tomorrow and Wednesday. These are just a few games that I wanted to get to today. Wanted to get to a few others, but didn't have the time to do appropriate research to the point where I would feel comfortable giving a full-on preview and prediction for them. These are some of the games that I took more of a keen interest in because their point spreads are pretty short, and they're either Big Ten or SEC games. This is once again a little bit of a slower slate. But make sure that you've liked the show, that you've subscribed to the channel, and that you've hit the notification bell. Just do those things. And yeah, let's get started. And I think the most appropriate place to start is Minnesota traveling to Iowa for the Floyd of Rosedale game. I'm very excited to watch this. I'm happy that it's not a noon game. It's going to be starting later in the day. And it's a rivalry game. It's one of the Big Ten West games that I've always appreciated watching. Very low scoring, very defensive. I'm kind of thinking that this game is going to go a specific way that you will all see in this segment. But let me know down below, between Minnesota at Iowa, Northwestern at Nebraska, and Ole Miss at Oklahoma, who you think the victors are. Let's get right to it. The Minnesota Golden Gophers travel to face off against the Iowa Hawkeyes in Kinnick Stadium to battle for the Floyd of Rosedale trophy. The beautiful bronze pig is what these two programs are fighting for, along with their pride and honor this Saturday. Iowa is favored by 8.5 points. That's about where the line opened up at. This game will be broadcasted 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time on CBS. 2:30 p.m. local time will be about when this game kicks off. Both teams are 5-2, 3-1 in Big Ten Conference play, with understandable losses in Big Ten play. Minnesota losing to number 1 ranked Ohio State, and Indiana beating Iowa in Kinnick 20-15, the number 2 ranked Indiana Hoosiers. But they have some weird out-of-conference losses. Minnesota losing to a Cal team that I don't think is very good by multiple scores, and Iowa losing in a close game to rival Iowa State, who since then has won some more games, but has also dropped, I believe, 2 in a row. Most recent drop was to Colorado, and that was after they lost in a very painful fashion to Cincinnati, although maybe a cathartic fashion for Iowa fans. Let's kick this off by talking about Minnesota, the road team, who's coming off of a tremendous victory over Nebraska. 24-6 was the score in that matchup. And it was closer than that, I would say, but it was very evident who the better coached team was, who wanted this game more, who the more physical team was. It was more evident who brought more to the table and who was getting the most out of what they had. So you have two chefs, and they have their own cabinets full of ingredients. I think Nebraska has more ingredients and higher quality ingredients available in their refrigerator, stocked on their shelves, in their cabinets. They have more cash to go to the grocery store. Minnesota lacks the resources at home and the ability to get resources that Nebraska does, but yet they cooked a better dish, they baked a better dish in their kitchen. and that's why they won 24-6. I mean, that was a as dominant as a second half as you'll probably see from Minnesota all year round. They had multiple 90-plus yard touchdown drives that were well executed, that were on point, that were perfectly drawn up. I think maybe the first one was scripted, but the last one, the second 90-yard touchdown drive, was very impressive because that was early third quarter. And at that point, you're making adjustments, you're calling play calls based on what you see. Maybe it was scripted out of the half, but they went down the field with Drake Lindsey and Brockington and Tracy and Bibber and all of those receivers and tight ends, and then they scored. And they scored touchdowns, held Nebraska to field goals. And yes, the wins over Rutgers and Purdue, especially with hindsight, are ugly. And the loss to Cal was ugly. The win over Buffalo was ugly. The loss to Ohio State, it's Ohio State. They're the best team or second best team in America. A loss to them is always going to look ugly by the scoreboard. I don't hold that against them because they're just that good of a team. But recently, I think, with that win against Nebraska and how the defense, I feel, was able to step up and bend but don't break situations against Purdue, maybe Minnesota's turning a corner here. We'll have to see. I do think this team has a lot to improve upon, but there is also a cap to them, and they've played through 7 games. It's enough of a sample size to, I think, draw some conclusions. And Minnesota has a future quarterback who I don't know if he'll be playing on Sundays. I wouldn't project that right now, but he has the arm strength and accuracy and poise to where one day he might be able to play in a professional league. And I think that he will continue to grow and have success as the year goes on and in future seasons, whether at Minnesota or, because of the crazy world we have right now, elsewhere. Minnesota is an average college football team. Average, maybe below average Power 4 team. And then maybe above average or even a good FBS team, college football team, to correct myself from earlier. You see that in their FPI, S&P Plus, and points per play margin. They're 5-2 with a negative points per play margin, and you can thank California and Ohio State for that, who it combined thoroughly dominated them. Ohio State, it wasn't even close. You could tell after that first drive, there was no way Minnesota was doing anything. They were never going to cover the spread against that Ohio State team based on just the styles between the two teams, the talent, everything going Ohio State's way in the sense that they're better coached, they have the better roster, and it was on the road. They were never competing in that game. California nearly doubling up their score, and their freshman quarterback having kind of a lights-out game against a secondary that has Coy Parrish and Kerry Brown and Zaquan Bryan and great players was a bit of a surprise, especially given how California's offense is pretty anemic and their team is pretty anemic. They're not playing all that well. And that, along with struggles against Rutgers and Purdue, and look, they beat Nebraska and they beat them soundly, but that's 1 game out of 7. You can see that while they are improved from where they were a week ago, and the power ratings reflect that, they were about maybe a tenth or a few tenths of a point above or below the average FBS team per FPI. Now they're 2.7 points better. So they gained a few points after that Nebraska win. Same in S&P Plus from Bill Connolly. But you have to make those minor adjustments and have to accept the fact that, look, I think the coaching staff is doing a good job of making adjustments. I think Danny Collins is improving as a defensive coordinator in every game. I believe that they do a good job of, squeezing out every bit of talent they can, but they're still not good at running the football. Nebraska does have some questions on run defense after all, and they are at their best when they can pass the football successfully, and they were able to against a good Nebraska secondary, so that's something I'm paying very close attention here, is Javon Tracy, Drake Lindsey, Lemeke Brockington, the receivers that they have, Logan Loya. I'm paying close attention to that for sure, but they struggle to run the ball. They are okay at stopping the run, though not amazing there. And in pass coverage, it's similar. The defense overall is above average to good in the Power Four, but it's not the unit it was last year with Corey Heatherman. It's actually, I think, pretty far behind that unit, especially in pass defense. And some of those numbers might be inflated because of how bad Raiola is with holding onto the football and how bad his offensive line is. I give credit to Minnesota, especially at quarterback, receiver, and actually, I'm very critical of their offensive line in run blocking, and I know Darius Taylor's been hurt, so that doesn't help their rushing attack. They've been sound, and they've been okay in pass blocking. They've done a good job protecting Drake Lindsey. So I think that they are going to bring some things to the table that can test Iowa's defense, a defense that is very blitz heavy, loves to leave their corners and their DBs on islands, and I think Minnesota may be able to take advantage of that to a degree. Defensively, they're not going to let Iowa hang 50 or 40 on them, but they will let Iowa probably hang, in the 20s or around there. They're not as good as Indiana, not nearly as good as Indiana on the defensive side of the football. As for Iowa's really impressed me because they are a power-rated top 25 team right now, despite losing a little under 50% of their production. Ohio State is the reloading story of college football right now, as they should be, who should also be in that conversation if you look at a more microscopic level and don't only care about national championships. If you do, then Oregon should be in the conversation with Ohio State too. But just on a basis of losing a ton and staying the same or approaching that is Iowa. And Iowa, I would argue, is actually a better team than they were last year. They're 24th in FPI, 22nd in S&P Plus, and they're 14th in points per play margin. These are pretty impressive numbers here from an Iowa team that has played Indiana, who's top 4 in the power ratings, top 3, maybe. They have an argument to be anywhere from 1 to 4, I think. Indiana does. Iowa State is not fantastic, but they're a solid team, and they've also played, Penn State team who fired their head coach. That was a somewhat concerning win, there. But how they were able to rebound against Rutgers on the road before I think Rutgers kind of broke a little bit, and playing Indiana that competitively, I think is impressive, honestly. When you look at this Minnesota game, they get a bye after that to host Oregon, then they travel to USC, host Michigan State, play at Nebraska. I think that 8-4, 9-3 is very realistic here. And I believe that would be a successful season for Iowa because they would be going over their win total. Although, to be fair, no one guessed that Penn State would have 4 losses. I don't think even the biggest haters of Penn State thought they could enter the month of November with 4 losses. But that's beside the point. Iowa's a good team in the power leagues, not just a good team in the FBS, but they are a good team in the power leagues. Their offense, it's average, above average. This defense is great, near elite. And if they continue to put up the performances they have ever since that Rutgers game where they got burnt a little early, they could be in that conversation of top 5 defenses at the end of the year. I love their center, Logan Jones. Jennings Dunker is about as Midwestern offensive lineman as you can get, alongside of Austin Saraveld, for example. You guys know what I'm talking about. They have the farmer build is what they have. And they're very great, fantastic tackles. Logan Jones, again, fantastic center. I like what Iowa was able to do in the run game with Mark Gronowski at quarterback. You got Kamari Moulton, Jason Patterson, some freshmen in there. They've improved a little bit at wide receiver, enough to have a passing game that sometimes can keep you honest, but it is still inconsistent and will continue to be against this schedule with the DBs they'll play on an average weekend. I love their defense specifically, though. So Xavier Nwapka, TJ Hall, Deshaun Lee, Cohen Entringer, their defensive line. So Jonah Pace, Aaron Graves, Max Llewellyn, Ethan Herkett, they've done a really good job stopping the run, defending the pass. I was impressed against Indiana how many times they were able to send pressure and Mendoza was standing in the pocket, and Iowa's defensive backs were able to stay in the vicinity of Surratt or Omar Cooper Jr., or sometimes were able to, such as Iowa's last real drive, I would say, when it was tied 13-13, they were able to intercept Mendoza. And I think force, is one of his only 2 interceptions on the year. And also give credit to Iowa's linebackers, Carson Sherrar and Jaden Montgomery. This is a fantastic defense. It's a defense that, with Phil Parker at the helm, is one of the nation's best. And I think that, along with the rushing offense they have and how that matches up with Minnesota, where Minnesota struggles to run, Iowa's excellent at stopping it. Iowa is great at running the ball. I would argue they're statistically a bit undervalued because of some of the defensive linemen they've played. So Dominique Orange, Michael Kamara, Kellen Wyatt, Tyreek Tucker, for example, mostly in those 2 losses. But even against Penn State, like Denida Sutton, Zane Durant, they've had to play a lot of high-caliber future NFL defensive linemen who are more talented than a lot of the offensive linemen they have, even though many Hawkeye offensive linemen will be playing on Sundays. So Iowa has a trench advantage here that I think is very, very demonstrative. When you have a 49.4% rushing success rate, which is top 10, and defensively you only allow 3.62 yards per carry, also top 10, and you're facing a team in Minnesota that can pass the ball, can be pass heavy if they want to, but also wants to run it with Darius Taylor, and leaned on that against Nebraska, I think you have some favorable matchup advantages that go your way. And that's why I think Iowa is going to win, and not just win, but I'm picking them to cover the spread as well. I think that Iowa being the better team and having those specific matchup edges, and on top of that having the better staff, I think they have it all outside of the passing game, where I do think Minnesota will have a slight air edge. However, I also believe that with how young Lindsey is and the fact that they don't have uber-talented receivers and their offensive line is vulnerable, I do think Iowa defensively, whether it is in stopping the intermediate pass, the quick game, or in shutting down the run, I think in those phases, Iowa's going to dominate. The deep pass, I do see with how Lindsey likes to play and how they do like to dial it up deep for him and his arm strength, and Minnesota has some underrated speed at receiver, and Iowa loves to send pressure. I do think that Minnesota will get maybe, 1, 2, or 3 deep shots here that are successful. Maybe one goes for a touchdown, or they just get them close to the red zone enough for Brady Denneberg to get into field goal range. But I think Iowa's defense is going to win in most, if not all, phases of their game, and Iowa should be able to run the football well enough to keep Minnesota's offense on the field, to move in between the 20s, and I think Kirk Ferentz owns PJ Fleck, and Iowa has the better overall team. So that's why I'm picking the Hawkeyes to win and cover and retain the Floyd of Rosedale Trophy, to keep it in Iowa City. Looking at the Big Ten standings here, Iowa and Minnesota are both tied for 3rd. Ohio State and Indiana are the only teams in that, tied first category, the only teams that are undefeated in the Big Ten, and 2 out of the 5 teams, or maybe 6 teams, that are undefeated nationally. A win here for either Iowa or Minnesota gives bowl eligibility, and also, in theory, keeps you alive for a playoff spot. Though I think that goes more for Iowa, because at least they host, or I know they travel to USC, but Oregon, Ohio State, and Indiana are way ahead of USC. They just are. They're far better teams. I'd rather get Oregon at home and have to travel to USC than have to travel to Oregon and not play USC at all. I think traveling to Oregon is probably at this point a death sentence for anyone. Maybe even it'd be a death sentence for Indiana if they had to rematch. I don't think it would be. I don't think it'd be for Ohio State, but for anyone besides those two in the Big Ten, it'd be a death sentence. And Oregon would be favored in Autzen over, I think, anyone in America right now if they hosted them there. So I think Iowa's going to keep maybe a sliver of hope alive for the playoffs. I don't see them winning out, though, and I don't see Minnesota winning out, not just because of this game, but having to travel to Oregon and a few other games on their schedule, such as a road trip to Northwestern, which preseason I thought would be a cupcake. Now I don't really think so anymore. It's going to be chaos. This game is going to be a part of chaos. Maybe a lot of you aren't as interested in it as I am, but I'm going to be watching this game and paying close attention to both the Gophers and the Hawkeyes. Now we can discuss Northwestern at Nebraska. I think this is the game that many of you are expecting me to talk about, to give a preview of. That's why most of you are probably here, if we're being honest. Null the God of Buckeyes, thank you for the $3 super chat. I really appreciate it. Really, really appreciate it. So, thank you for that $3 super chat. All right. Let's get to Northwestern and Nebraska. I'm gonna have takeaways from the Minnesota-Nebraska game released tomorrow. I just didn't have the time today, for a variety of reasons, to watch film on it and really digest it. I'll probably be doing that tomorrow morning, and then in the afternoon, or maybe I'll do it in the morning and late morning or even mid-morning or early tomorrow morning, sometime tomorrow before the evening when Pate and most everyone else goes live. There will be those takeaways up from the Minnesota game, more in-depth, detailed takeaways. All right. The Northwestern Wildcats travel to Memorial Stadium to play the 5-2 Nebraska Cornhuskers. Both Northwestern and Nebraska stand at 5-2. But there are completely different feelings, I think, about both of these teams surrounding both the Wildcats and the Cornhuskers, despite them having the same record. So this will be a noon game on FS1. Nebraska opened up as an 8.5-point favorite. The line came slightly down to Nebraska minus 7.5. Northwestern is playing the traveler, and the Huskers are playing the host. I believe there is a lot of optimism around Northwestern and praise for David Braun as a head coach for guiding Northwestern to this 5-2 start. And the fact that they're tied for third in Big Ten standings right now is absolutely hilarious. That is one of the funnier and cooler and more admirable stories of any Big Ten team this year, is that Northwestern's coming off a shutout. It's their first 5-2 start since, I believe, 2015. And that was, a decade ago. And for Nebraska, there are feelings of pessimism, anger, and confusion at the 5-2, 2-2 start in Big Ten Conference play, where they are reeling off a Friday night humiliation 6-24 final score in favor of the Minnesota Golden Gophers. For both of these teams, a win here means bowl eligibility, which for Northwestern would be huge, and honestly for Nebraska it would be huge too. I'm not going to lower their expectations. That would be wrong of me to do. They still need to win 8 or 9 games for the year to be anywhere close to a success, to be a success. However, they have to, after the game against Northwestern, the remaining 4 games are USC at home, traveling to UCLA, traveling to Penn State, and hosting Iowa. This is the easiest game. This is the easiest game left on Nebraska's schedule. It just is. So they have to win this. This is a must-win for Nebraska. Probably a must-win in a certain sense for Northwestern as well, given what Nebraska is coming off of, given how they looked against Minnesota, and the fact that after this game, Northwestern's remaining games, I believe, include not in any order, but at Illinois, hosting Michigan, hosting Minnesota, and I forget who their other game. Oh, yeah, Friday night trip to USC. That you're dead the minute you arrive if you're Northwestern. So must-win spot for both of these teams, and I want to talk about Northwestern first as they are the road team. So Northwestern started off the year, blowout loss to Tulane, win over Western Illinois, FCS school, and it was a bit of a struggle too. Lost to Oregon 34-14. It was 34-0 at one point. Stone, quarterback Preston Stone, in that game, I think threw 0 touchdowns and 6 or 7 interceptions. And until the Purdue game, in all of his other games, he was perfect in TDI-INT ratio in Northwestern's 4 wins before their win over Purdue, where I watched part of that game. Very impressed with Northwestern's defense. That offense is rough. It actually reminds me a lot of their 2023 team. That's what this Northwestern team reminds me of. The 2023 team that took advantage of a schedule that was a little bit easier than anticipated. They lost pretty badly to the good teams they had to play, lost games early, but they picked up momentum as the year went on. They took advantage of some teams that were disappointing. So they beat Wisconsin and Madison when they were worse than I think about anyone expected. Did something similar to Penn State a few weeks ago that ultimately got Franklin fired. I've been impressed with the coaching job David Braun has done, and no matter how the season finishes out, I don't think that he will be fired, given the start they had and some of the wins they had. I mean, they've already had 3 Big Ten wins. They did, I think, a better job against Oregon than most teams will do all year, and that even some teams in the playoff would do if they had to travel to Autzen. At least, they held Oregon to 34 points, tested them a bit in the trenches, scored some points late even though it was in garbage time. Not a lot of teams can say that. Rutgers, for example, can't say that. They were down 56-3 at one point and lost 56-10. Trips to Nebraska, USC, and Illinois, and then hosting Michigan and Minnesota will be tough, but is one of those games winnable? Well, according to FPI, they'd be favored over Minnesota neutral field. They're only a 1-score underdog to Nebraska. They'll probably only be a 1-score underdog to Illinois, or close to that, maybe a 2-score underdog. And as for Michigan and USC, they'll probably be 2-score underdogs there, maybe even 3 to USC. So odds say they'll probably win at least one more game and go bowling, and that's very impressive. What I am concerned about with Northwestern is that they barely have a positive points per play margin, very similar to Minnesota. You have a winning record now, but you've won a ton of close games, and against the great teams, competent teams you faced, you have been absolutely owned. So you are just an average FBS team. You are a below average, maybe even bad Power 4 team. I'll actually give Minnesota a little bit more benefit of the doubt here because they do have more talent to work with, and that win over Nebraska was impressive, even factoring in the fact that a lot went right for Minnesota in that they played their best game all season long. That's the best I'd seen them all year. And for Nebraska, it was one of their worst performances. I would actually say, not just offensively, which was pretty bad, but defensively, too. That was the worst their secondary had looked all season long. Northwestern loves to turn it over, and they don't exactly force turnovers either. So they have a negative 0.7 turnover margin per game. That's on Preston Stone for throwing picks and coughing up the ball. It's also on Northwestern's defense for not forcing a lot of turnovers. Bless me there. Northwestern allows over 6 yards per carry from their opponents. I do not think that they are that big or physical up front. I think the strength for Northwestern relies in Aiden Hubbard, for example, their top defensive end, and some of their defensive backs that I like. So for Northwestern, you're talking Fred Davis II, Braden Turner, Robert Fitzgerald, Gardner Wallace, Mac Ulayan, preseason great middle linebacker. Don't know exactly how great he is right now. A forced fumble, 3 picks, 34 solo tackles. I'd say he's pretty good. He'll be tested in this game, though, by tough runner in Emmett Johnson and trying to get to quarterback Dylan Raiola, who does hold onto the ball too long and doesn't have a ton of time in the pocket, but also has made some pretty amazing plays off script when protection breaks down. Northwestern is good at running the football, though, at least I would say relative to the talent they have, and they don't give up a lot of pressure on the offensive line. I think their addition of Martez Lewis, who's their starting right tackle, was smart. Caleb Tiernan is a future NFL tackle, so they have NFL tackles. Griffin, is it Wildy or Wildy, incoming transfer from South Dakota State, is on pace to potentially hit 1,000 yards, and if he stays through the bowl game, even more likely that that's the case, as 513 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns. I think that Northwestern's offense does have some substance to it, at least here and there, and that combined with what they have defensively, I think gives them a shot in this game. Is it a huge shot? We'll have to see, because Northwestern, in theory, does struggle to get pressure. They struggle to dominate the lines of scrimmage, and they struggle in run defense. In that regard, they're similar to Nebraska. I'd actually say they might even be worse in stopping the run. But Nebraska is pretty poor at stopping the run themselves. And more importantly, they're pretty poor at protecting the quarterback. So Nebraska is probably an above average good Power 4 team. They are, to put things in perspective here, I believe they are in between Iowa and they're not better than Illinois after Friday. They're what Illinois is. Them and Illinois, I think, are pretty equal. Similar to what both teams were last year. I just think Illinois is better coached and Nebraska probably has better talent, is the way to put it. But from a power ratings angle, I think Nebraska is a similar team to Illinois. Different strengths, different weaknesses. Coaching's different. Special teams are different in favor of the Cornhuskers this time around. But in a power ratings angle, if you put them together and faced off neutral field, the line would be very competitive. Nebraska, their win over Cincinnati on a neutral field is aging pretty well, although that was more of a home game, even though technically neutral site. And honestly, they're probably at Cincinnati's level too, given how close that game was. In ESPN's FPI, I'll check this live right now. Is Cincinnati rated ahead of Nebraska? No. They're rated about 4/10 of. They're rated 4/10 of a point lower than the Cornhuskers are in FPI, which I think about tracks. They're about what Illinois and Nebraska are. Cincinnati is. Those three teams, I think, power ratings wise, are pretty similar. They have some really good non-negotiables and really good players, and I think they all have talented quarterbacks, but they have some different strengths and weaknesses. Nebraska beat Cincinnati. They won all of their non-con games, blew out Akron, blew out Houston Christian. I think analytically, the power ratings got a little bit too much juice from those wins over the garbage teams. And Nebraska, obviously, if you listen to some of Rule's halftime speeches and the vibes at the time around the team, he wanted to run up the score there. Against Michigan, a lot of things in the trenches are exposed. Michigan didn't even play all that well. I think Michigan played much better against Washington, for example, than they did against Nebraska. Michigan still won and controlled the game really from the second quarter onward. Nebraska struggled against Michigan State, struggled against Maryland, had to come back from behind after Raiola threw 3 picks. And at Minnesota, Raiola didn't turn it over as much, but Nebraska surrendered a historic 9 sacks to the Golden Gopher defense. So looking at the Cornhuskers here, I think that their skill positions offensively are strong, but the offensive line is terrible. And I think some of the mechanics about Raiola, while he overall is a strength, I think his mechanics play into opponents who can abuse Nebraska's pass pro. So Maryland, I don't know why they couldn't exactly do that. They did get some pressure. That's why some of the turnover stuff happened, and they did get a sack. But Minnesota did a really good job. I think in large part in coverage. And because of that, Raiola, instead of getting the football away or going down to maybe a check down route, or I don't know exactly what's going on, because Nebraska, in some pass protection metrics, is giving him, the required 3 to 4 seconds to throw, which is pretty good. But he's not getting the ball out quickly. And while they do often give him some time, there are also often plays where one of their offensive linemen completely misses an assignment on a blitz, doesn't get picked up, and, well, he just goes down because he has to. Otherwise, he's going to take a big hit. Their success rate passing, thanks to Dane Key, Ja'Cory Barney Jr., and Isaiah Hunter, is approaching 50%. It's a 49.2%. They're 22nd there. A key statistic for this game is that Nebraska allows 4.2 sacks per game if you take out the FCS game. So even including Akron, but just taking out Houston Christian, against FBS opponents, they're allowing over 4 sacks per game and many more pressures. That's on Elijah Pritchett. That's on Gunnar Katula. That's on the entire offensive line. It's also on Dylan Raiola, too. It is. So you can't fix that midseason. You have to adjust. You have to make changes to your strengths to compensate for that weakness. That's how bad of a weakness that is. Their secondary is 4th in yards allowed per dropback, only allowing 4.45. In terms of success rate and expected points added allowed per dropback, they're dropping pretty quickly. And I think that's because something I said in the Michigan State game that wasn't proven right then, but I think maybe I was a bit too early on, is this secondary's good. It's great. But was it ever going to be elite given the talent it had? And I don't think so. I think that maybe part of the Michigan State game was due to the weather. Maybe it was a mirage. There were Michigan receivers who couldn't catch the ball but were open and who were faster than those Nebraska DBs. And for Minnesota, it was the same thing, except they could actually catch the ball, make some contested catches, get open in space. Drake Lindsey, I think maybe because of that extra year and because of how his offense is, and also because, he was playing in Game 7. Underwood was playing Nebraska in Game 4. He was able to quickly get the football out and anticipate where the holes in the zone would be, or which man would be beating which defender. I think Sear Wright and Andrew Marshall and Deshaun Singleton in that secondary are great, but they're not locked down in the same way that Alabama's or Ohio State's secondary is. So there is some pause for me from Nebraska overall defensively and offensively after that game, but I've had some pause at different areas for the entire season, so I don't want to overreact to the Minnesota game, and I don't think people should either. That's why I think Nebraska wins, but I am also going to hedge on this and say that Northwestern covers. Northwestern is a confident team. I think that they are well coached to this point in the year, and they have capable players on defense and capable pass rushers too. So that's not a good matchup. I mean, Michael Kilbane and Aiden Hubbard and Anto Saka. So Kilbane is 2.5 sacks. Hubbard is 2.5 sacks. Saka has 3. I think that with the rotation they have there, they could eat up Nebraska's tackles, I think. And I would predict that to happen, actually. A huge part of the reason why I'm picking Nebraska to win here is their special teams. They're more talented, and they're also at home. So I can't pick Nebraska to lose. I think, actually, if they don't win in a close game, I think it's more likely they win by more than a score. They win by 2 scores or 3 scores or something, solely because of the talent mismatch. And Northwestern has had some luck bounce their way. I mean, they just shut out Purdue 19-0, and their points per play margin is barely positive. Well, Nebraska's is above of a, 1/10 of a point per play margin. which is, basically the sign through 7 games of a good team. Noon game, it's going to be sold out regardless because Nebraska fans are that awesome. I think Nebraska's going to move on to 6-2, and that USC game, given it's a night game, it's going to be the blackout. That is going to be the Super Bowl for Nebraska. The Michigan game was shaped out to be the Super Bowl. I sort of, just due to matchups and how Michigan, at least at the time, I thought it was going to be them or Penn State who was going to be the toughest team in the trenches for the Cornhuskers. Now it's Michigan or Iowa. I just think stylistically the USC game always meant more for what Nebraska is as a program right now than a Michigan game where you still have a talent deficit, a size and trench deficit too. Nebraska wins. I do think Northwestern covers here, though. We'll be curious to see if I'm proven right on that, or if Nebraska wins by a wider margin, or if Northwestern pulls off the upset somehow, some way. There are going to be very dark times in Lincoln, Nebraska. And last but certainly not least, I forgot to do the standings. I did. I did forget to do that. I even forgot to bring up the matchups. I'm tired. That's why that is. Let me see if there are any more super chats in here. There are not. It's good that we still have good amounts of views, though. We're just going to do this Ole Miss Oklahoma preview and prediction, and then we will get out of here. These games will be uploaded. In fact, I might even record a brief segment for the matchups for Nebraska and Northwestern. Yeah, I'll do that, but I want to get to Ole Miss Oklahoma first. So let's do that. The top 10, the 8th-ranked Ole Miss Rebels, who stand at 6-1, 3-1 in SEC play, travel to face off against the 6-1, 2-1 Oklahoma Sooners, who are ranked 13th. Top 15 matchup, top 15 SEC matchup. It will be broadcasted at noon Eastern time, 11 a.m. local time on ABC. Oklahoma is a 4.5-point favorite. The Sooners coming off of a road win over South Carolina. I believe final score was 26-3. Ole Miss reeling off of a close but still a loss, 43-35 loss on the road to Georgia, that it looked like at one point when they led 35-26 that maybe Ole Miss was going to come out with a win in Sanford. But Kirby Smart prevailed. Still, they're track to the playoffs, alive and well. Same thing with the Sooners, track to the playoffs, very much alive and well. Starting off with the Rebels here, they're playing the road team. Undefeated up until that Georgia game. Some close, scary wins over Kentucky, Arkansas, Washington State, teams that aren't really good. I don't even think LSU's really all that good. The Tulane win was pretty impressive, honestly. And whenever you beat someone 63-7, even if they're as bad as Georgia State, that's impressive too. I will come out and say, and Rebel fans, don't hate me here, I don't think that Ole Miss is a top 10 team, but I have been impressed with Kiffin's coaching job. This team is in no way, shape, or form as talented as last year's team. There's drop-off at quarterback, wide receiver, offensive line, tight end due to injury, massive drop-off at defensive line, linebacker, DB. Basically, I'd say everything except running back, where Ole Miss, I think, would have liked to have Kawan Lacey last year. Everything but running back is a downgrade, and maybe even a major downgrade. So the fact that they are already bowl eligible and they have a chance against Oklahoma on the road, they'll be favored over South Carolina, they will beat the Citadel, they will be favored over Florida, favored over Mississippi State. Ole Miss is on track to go 10-2. And that's pretty impressive. That would be a pretty impressive season. I think that would be a fringe coach of the year caliber season for Lane Kiffin if they go 10-2. If they beat Oklahoma and then went out and go 11-1, I think Lane Kiffin might deserve the coach of the year award. Rebels are 11th in FPI, 12th in S&P Plus. They're top 25 in points per play margin. Let's look at some of the strengths and weaknesses, of the Rebels here. So Trinidad Chambliss and Ole Miss's wide receivers. That's DeJon Stribling, Caden Lee, Harrison Wallace III. I think that they have a really good fit together, where Chambliss can improvise a bit. He, I think, is a jack of all trades and a master of none. He's not supremely talented, but he is a smart player. He knows the playbook very well. He's disciplined. He maximizes his own talent, and he knows how to get the ball out quickly and get it to the right guy. So I like what Ole Miss has from a passing offense angle. And Kawan Lacey was a great pickup in the transfer portal. A fantastic pickup. My issue with Ole Miss, and I think their biggest weakness, is their defense. Their rushing defense, pretty porous. They give up a 45.8% rushing success rate. They only get an 8.7% defensive havoc rate. And those numbers just aren't good, guys. Whether it is Will Eccles, Xavier Harris, Suntarine Perkins, Cam Franklin, Deshaun Womack, Princewell, Unman Malin, I don't think their portal additions up front have panned out in the way they did for last year's team. And they're a bit young up there. Like Eccles and Franklin are true sophomores. They're a little bit younger. They're not as bigger. They're not as NFL-like, not as freakish. And whereas last year they had one of the best run defenses in America and one of the best pass rushes, probably even the best pass rush in America last year, one of the best, it's dropped off in a major way. And they struggle to create turnovers, sacks, forced fumbles. They struggle to stuff the run. I mean, the fact they held Georgia, I believe, 4.5 yards per carry on the ground was pretty impressive relative to what I expected Georgia to do to that Ole Miss defense. This is a team that is well coached. They know how to put together an elite strategy offensively. I'm fascinated to see what Lane Kiffin will do against a Brent Venables defense. That's going to be quite the storyline and very fascinating. But also, it's interesting. There's a lot of unknown, I think, between what Oklahoma's offense can do against this Ole Miss defense. That is where I think the unknown is. We know that Ole Miss's offense is probably not elite, but it's great. And they can put together elite scripts, and they make elite adjustments. We know Oklahoma's defense is elite in all phases, right? So I think that's why Oklahoma is favored here by more than just the 3 points home field. I think the matchup where you'd lean Oklahoma's defense against this Ole Miss offense and then Oklahoma's offense against this Ole Miss defense, Oklahoma can't run, Ole Miss can't stop the run. Oklahoma does a good job protecting the quarterback, but they're not awesome there. Ole Miss struggles to get to the quarterback, but they also have enough talent at secondary to probably maybe give Mateer some issues or cover these wide receivers well enough. And Pete Golding is a good enough defensive coordinator. So there are a lot of unknowns here, and this is going to be a different road test from the one that Georgia presented, where Georgia presented an offense that I think almost any defense in college football would struggle to stop. Obviously, Oklahoma or Ohio State would not allow 43 points. They would not allow Georgia to, I believe, score on every possession they had. I think Georgia did. I don't think they punted at all for the whole game. I think Ole Miss just held them to field goals, and those were the defensive wins. But Georgia's offense would at least score some on those defenses. Those defenses I don't think would hold Georgia scoreless, for example. That's a good Georgia offense. But the Georgia defense is outside the top 25 in efficiency currently. As for Oklahoma, they are one of the best defenses in America, but their offense is outside of the top 25 in efficiency. So, what do the Sooners bring to the table? What does Oklahoma present here that can be a real challenge to the road team? Outside of, obviously, the home crowd and the pass rush and the defense playing off that. Well, I think that Lane Kiffin with Trinidad Chambliss and Lacey, even though they're not awesome at running the ball, they will want to test it. even if it's against an Oklahoma, defense that excels at stopping the run, is big on the inside, is really just big and athletic everywhere. And Brent Venables is a fantastic play caller. Oklahoma's only loss was an injured Mateer and probably somewhat of a bad game plan matched up against a Texas team that was more talented than Oklahoma. And quite honestly, not just more talented, but matches up with them incredibly well. After that Kentucky game, I don't even know if Texas is just straight up better than OU, though I would be inclined to say yes, they are. But on top of probably being the better team, Texas matches up well with Oklahoma because Texas is, in a lot of ways, like a better version of Oklahoma. They're very similar defensively in terms of the overall talent and how good they are. I think Texas is better at pass defense. Oklahoma's a tad bit better up front. Offensively, Texas's offensive line is much better at run blocking, and they're bigger there than Oklahoma. They have better backs. And Mateer is not a dramatically better passer than what Arch Manning is, nor his receivers dramatically better. So it's just always going to be a bad matchup. They went on the road, did business against South Carolina. That was very impressive. This Ole Miss team is going to be a challenge to them in a unique way. I do believe that Oklahoma's dominant defense, only allowing 3.85 yards per play, which is first, thanks to Kip Lewis, Kobe McKenzie, and then, Dominic Williams, R. Mason Thomas, David Stone up front. I love what this Oklahoma defense presents here. And I believe that on top of a 45% passing success rate, that's on John Mateer, that is on Deion Burks, and also their tight end, Jaron Kanak. And their tackles, I think, have done an effective job protecting John Mateer as well. They've performed better than I expected in a variety of different games, though the offensive line overall is still somewhat of a mess and is, discombobulated. Oklahoma here is a similar caliber team to Ole Miss, 14th in FPI. Bill Connolly's S&P Plus loves them. They have them as the 5th best team. They're 12th in points per play margin, above a 5th of a point per play margin, which means they score 0.221 more points per one of their plays compared to one of their opponent's plays. That's the hallmark of a great team. A great team. Better than Ole Miss in that area, similar in FPI, better in S&P Plus. They're playing host, and they're favored by 4.5 points, I think, for a reason. The unknown of their offense against Ole Miss's defense, I think, is something that it depends on whether or not Mateer is healthy. And I don't know how healthy he is, whether he's, at 70%, 80%, 90%, 100%. Don't know where he's at. Probably not 100%, but probably not anywhere lower than 80% either. I would assume. It's been a few weeks since that Texas game. I imagine that hand is being nursed, and they played pretty vanilla and pretty businesslike against South Carolina. This is definitely a bigger game, a game that they're going to prepare for more. So I like Oklahoma here. I believe that the Sooners are going to win, and I think they're going to cover. I don't think this game will get out of hand because Georgia is a clearly better team than Ole Miss, though I do believe Oklahoma matches up better against Ole Miss than Georgia does. But I do think Oklahoma, they're going to win by 7 points. Maybe they'll win by 10. I think they will be able to get to Trinidad Chambliss in pass rush in a way that Georgia just absolutely could not, because Oklahoma's pass rush is awesome. Georgia's is on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's pretty terrible. Oklahoma's better everywhere defensively, minus maybe linebacker and maybe D-tackle 1, I would argue. And they do call a better defense. Offensively, I don't expect a ton of success from Oklahoma, but similar to the Michigan game where Ben Arbuckle outcoached Wink Martindale, I expect Ben Arbuckle to outcoach Pete Golding here and move the football enough to get into scoring opportunities that convert into touchdowns or that convert into field goals. And, Michigan in that game did not play all that well at different parts defensively, but they held Oklahoma to 24 points, and Oklahoma really struggled to run even when they had a numbers advantage in the box. I don't think that'll be the case against an Ole Miss defense that really struggles to stop the run. So the Sooners are going to win here and also are going to cover. And I like their matchup edges against Ole Miss's passing offense and rushing offense. And as for Ole Miss's defense and Oklahoma's offense, I think there's going to be a lot of trading back and forth there. And I think the staffs and overall teams are pretty equal. Just Oklahoma's defense, I think, having key advantages over the Ole Miss offense. I think that Brent Venables is an excellent defensive mind in the same way that Kiffin is an offensive mind. So it comes down to the players and the talent that you have. And I think Oklahoma has the much better player on defense compared to Ole Miss on offense. That, along with home field advantage, I think will produce a Sooners win. Looking at the SEC standings here, Oklahoma has an opportunity to shoot up the board, be in that third or fourth spot. If they win this game here, they're tracked to potentially going to Atlanta, and the college football playoff are still alive and definitely healthy. They do have to travel on the road to play Alabama, though. I hate that matchup for them, but they will certainly be in the playoffs at 10-2. As for Ole Miss, this is the toughest game remaining on their schedule. If they lose here, their playoff hopes are still alive, much more so than if Oklahoma loses here. If they win, I would be in awe if they somehow missed the college football playoff. Yeah, Sooners win. Sooners also cover in a noon Eastern time SEC conference game. I know you can't tell it in my voice, but I honestly am excited for this matchup. All right, that's it, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I am going to release these segments out tonight and add on that the Nebraska Northwestern matchups and also talk a little bit about their conference standings. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Respect you guys. Love that you've tuned in. We've built quite the audience here. The fact that we're talking about these games and we still have this many concurrent viewers and views, I think, is something to be proud of. So thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you all very soon.